Condoleezza Rice is, in every sense of the word, a woman of the world. For us, in our country, we remember her for her public service. She was National Security Advisor from 2001 to 2005, and then she became Secretary of State from 2005 to 2009. I want to take you back to that first date. She's National Security Advisor in 2001. Does 9/11/2001 ring a bell for any of you? Keep that in the back of your mind as we take a look at the real Condoleezza Rice. Most of us do know her through her very public work with George W. Bush with his administration, his 8 years as president. She served as foreign policy advisor for his father during his presidential campaign. When Bush was elected, Rice became head of the National Security Council, and she was the first woman to hold that position. In 2005, she became the first African American woman to be named Secretary of State. What I've tried to do with this program is to move beyond that public sphere that we all have some awareness of Condoleezza Rice, and really take a look at the multi-talented and frankly multifaceted woman. She said this, quote, "I think my father thought I might be President of the United States. I think he would have been satisfied with Secretary of State. I'm a foreign policy person, and to have a chance to serve my country as the nation's chief diplomat at a time of great peril and consequence, that was enough." Condoleezza Rice is an accomplished woman. She is an accomplished student. She's an accomplished concert pianist. She's an accomplished golfer. She's an accomplished researcher. She's an accomplished diplomat. She's an accomplished strategic thinker. She's an accomplished teacher, and she's an accomplished university administrator. Fortunately for us, for the purposes of learning more about her, she's also an accomplished author. I've used 2 books written by Rice as my primary sources for today. She was very popular when she wrote these books. She wrote one right after the other. This is a picture of her at a book signing, and her book signings were notorious for having standing room only. The first book is No Higher Honor, a memoir of my years in Washington. It's published by Crown Publishing, and it was published in 2011. No Higher Honor is an incredibly informative memoir. She describes in exceptionally fine detail what was happening during those 8 years when she was in very public service. She takes us inside that world as she experienced it. Her detailed descriptions of the principals she worked closely with give us a much deeper understanding of the role that personalities play in politics. Among the most absorbing and chilling segments of No Higher Honor are those that deal with the lead up to 9/11 and what happened to our nation's leaders, not only on that day, but in the months and years to come. This is a memoir for American history junkies everywhere. Fair warning, it is detailed, dense. Even so, it is so beautifully written and clearly written that it's accessible to everyone. That avalanche of facts kind of softens under her pen. The other book of hers was published 1 year before, 2010, and it's entitled Extraordinary Ordinary People, a Memoir a family. Crown also published this one. Extraordinary Ordinary People is a much more personal book. While Rice's time in politics is recorded here too, there's a much more personal touch to the writing. Her focus in this book is on her remarkable family. Not just her nuclear family, she was an only child, but also the extended family. And that extended family included not only blood relatives, but also friends, both in and out of the workplace. In a very real sense, Extraordinary Ordinary People is a love letter to her father and her mother, two incredible parents who made certain that their brilliant and talented daughter would have every opportunity possible to succeed. While I didn't use this one, I have looked at it. I would be remiss if I didn't mention one more book. And it is called Democracy, Stories from the Long Road to Freedom. Rice published it in 2017. It's written to showcase in short segments things that have happened along America's long road to reach democracy and to retain it. It's an excellent book, and it's gotten excellent reviews by historians. My emphasis for the first part of this program is going to be her first book, Extraordinary Ordinary People. This one will give us an insight in the woman as a child, born in a time of great upheaval, in a place that was experienced that upheaval directly. Even in that chaos, her remarkable father and mother and others made certain that she knew there was something better worth working for. The book openly discusses growing up as a black female child in the South. It honors her mother and her father for their devotion to each other, to their faith, and to her. It provides keen insight in her own words into the formative growing up years of a little girl who would become world famous. She writes in the book, quote, "Good parents are a blessing. Mine were determined to give me a chance to live a unique and happy life. In that they succeeded, and that is why every night I begin my prayers saying, Lord, I can never thank you enough for the parents you gave me." You know, she's been sort of a beacon for us during tough times, but for her family, she was a beacon during ordinary, everyday days as she was growing up as this perfectly wonderful child. She and they always understood one principle, and it was a principle that they instilled in her and that she has lived her public and private life by. This is how she describes it, quote, "The essence of America, that which really unites us, is not ethnicity or nationality or religion. It is an idea, and what an idea it is, that you can come from humble circumstances and do great things, that it doesn't matter where you came from, but where you were going." Condoleezza Rice was born November 14th, 1954 in Birmingham, Alabama. Her parents were John Wesley Rice, Jr., who was a Presbyterian minister, a football coach, a guidance counselor, and a dean of students, and he was from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Her mother was Angelina Ray Rice, and she was a gifted high school English teacher. She was from just outside Birmingham. They were part of the first generation of middle-class blacks to attend historically black colleges. It surprised me when I read Condi's comments that her family was part of the first generation of blacks in the middle class to be able to attend the historically black colleges and universities. I'm going to refer to her as Condi from this point forward because that was the name she was known by as a child, and it is the name that she prefers to be called. Condi's father was pastor of the Westminster Presbyterian Church in Birmingham. Quite a nice church. He was also working when she was first born as a high school football coach. He became a guidance counselor, and later on he became dean of students at Stillman College, an historically black college in Tuscaloosa. Condi and her family spent most of her childhood years in the Titusville neighborhood of Birmingham. It's a middle-class black neighborhood where Condi says most of the homes had at least one teacher in them. It's a very highly educated group. Condi said in a podcast in 2022 the following, quote, "My father was clearly the person who stimulated my interest in history. He himself actually did his degree in theology, but he was always very interested in history. He could always tell these great tales about history, about the history of the United States, about the history of the world. And so I really credit him with my keen sense that the past mattered." Condi's parents married rather late in age. They were already established with their education and with their careers, so they waited. They postponed marriage. I think her mother was in her 20s, late 20s. Her father was in his early 30s. They recognized pretty quickly that their daughter had an unusually bright mind, and so they decided when she was very, very young that they would involve her in every aspect of the family to make her feel that she was a grown-up like they were. Some of those decisions were easy ones, of course. They let her watch television as long as she wanted to and watch anything she wanted to. But remember, there were fewer stations and a lot fewer shows back then, so they didn't really have to worry. One thing I thought was particularly charming in her book was when she described that the family had a routine every afternoon after school of sitting together and watching the Mickey Mouse Club together. They had Mickey Mouse hats and they would wear them and they would sing the songs and do all of that. Every evening, though, to sort of balance that, she and her family would watch the Huntley-Brinkley News Hour, and her father would carefully explain the day's events in terms of their historical significance. She writes, "My parents elected me president of the family when I was 4. We actually had an election every year and I always won. I'm an only child and I could count on my mother's vote." Her unusual name was selected precisely because it was unusual. It is from the term, in Italian music term rather, Condoleezza, which means with sweetness. Condi was a sweet child, but she was a determined one. Nurtured by parents who encouraged her, Condi thrived. One of her most vivid childhood memories, and think about this as a child, she's 8 years old, but she remembers the 13-day standoff we refer to today as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The family would watch the television news every evening, and her father would carefully explain to her what was going on. She even remembers playing nuclear attack as a child during this period. She and her little friends would go into a little small opening under her house, and that was their bomb shelter. Condi's mother, Angelina, was also a major force in her daughter's life. Her primary influence, besides providing unconditional love and encouragement, was that of a mentor. She set a great example for her daughter to see. She taught English and she insisted that Condi speak precisely and correctly. One of Angelina's students during her high school teaching days was Willie Mays. She was a mentor and someone to look up to. Angelina Rice received her master's in international education at the University of Denver in 1982. Angelina's own life journey inspired Condi. Earning that master's degree when Condi was a teenager made a big impression on her daughter. Angelina also encouraged Condi's love and talent with music early on. Her daughter had real talent. She was a child prodigy with piano, and she fully intended to go to college to become a concert pianist. She said in that same podcast when she was remembering her father's influence, she said, quote, "My mother was a musician, and very early on she bought a little book for me called Lives of the Great Composers. And so that part of the past, the history of Mozart's life, the history of Schubert's life, I would attribute that to my mother." She began taking piano lessons from her maternal grandmother when she was 3 years old, and she was a quick student. Her parents bought her a small electronic organ for their home so that she could practice. After she had taken 3 months of lessons, Condi asked for a piano. Her father said that when she could play "What a Friend We Have in Jesus" all the way through without a mistake, she could have one. The next day at her grandmother's house, she practiced for 8 straight hours, refusing even to stop for snacks or lunch. When her parents came to pick her up that afternoon, she played it without a single mistake. Her parents rented her the piano the next day. She made the comment, "I could read music before I could read." You know, it's interesting when you think about child prodigies. We've had them in chess, we've had them in music, of course, we've had them in mathematics. But to really know the life of one and to realize what she intended to be and what her obvious talent intended for her to be in life turned out to be not the thing that she's most famous for. From her father, she learned to love football. It was a second passion for her right after music. And one of the many jobs that her father had was being a football coach. And so coaching was obviously natural to him, and he coached his daughter on how to understand football. Every Sunday afternoon after church, Condi and her daddy watched the National Football League game on television. He would analyze every offensive play, explaining what the intent was, and then he would explain the defensive play and help her to understand what that intent was. That analysis back and forth scored with this little girl. She loved the tactical thinking, the strategic thing. As just a matter of point, she and her father especially loved the Cleveland Browns. Today, Condi's well known as a big football fan, and that all goes back to her father's influence. Her connection with the Denver Broncos actually goes back to the 1970s. She was working on her doctorate at the time, and she was dating Broncos star kick returner Rick Upchurch. They eventually broke up after several years, but she describes it as a gentle breakup, and they've remained good friends. 2 careers got in the way. I told you that her parents did everything they possibly could to enrich Condi's life, to help her see that there was life beyond the life that she was living as a child. They visited Washington, D.C. when she was 10, and I love this photograph. There she is, a rather stately, rather tall for her age, 10-year-old, and she's right in front of the White House. Her father took the picture. Of course, little did they know that one day she would in fact be working in the White House. This picture I think is charming. It shows Condi as a 7-year-old. She enrolled at the Lane Elementary School in Birmingham, and she loved it. She had had a little bit of a problem because her birthday in November fell after that magic date when children are allowed to enter school. So she was sort of scheduled to miss a year, and her parents were not going to have that. So her mother homeschooled her for a year, and then she entered Lane Elementary in the 2nd grade. She tested to be actually a lot higher than that. She joined the Lane Elementary School band. Now, they didn't have a piano, need a pianist, so she played the bells because she could already read music. She'd been in lessons for 4 years by now. And the keyboard's essentially the same, except instead of her fingers, she would hit the notes with a mallet. Her parents did everything they could think of to be sure this only child of theirs understood everything was possible. She took ballet lessons. She took gymnastics lessons. She took baton twirling lessons, and she took French lessons. Her favorite sport, and for her to participate in, and the only one that she ever really played with any enthusiasm for any length of time, was bowling. Later, while she was working in Washington, D.C., she discovered golf and tennis, 2 passions of hers even today. Looking back on her childhood and the way her parents made sure that not only was she getting a good, solid education, but she was getting a good, solid education about life, Condi said this: "Education is transformational. It changes lives. That is why people work so hard to become educated, and why education has always been the key to the American dream, the force that erases arbitrary divisions like race and class and culture and unlocks every person's God-given potential." She spent her first 11 years living in Birmingham. When she was 8, a classmate of hers was killed in the 1963 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. Condi heard the explosion. She also saw the riots and felt the anger in the Birmingham streets. When she was 11, the family moved to Tuscaloosa, where they lived 2 years while her dad worked at Stillman. 2 years after that, Condi and her family moved to Denver, Colorado, so that her dad could do graduate studies. You know, Denver opened the world in a whole new way for Condi. This is a picture of her with 2 of her girlfriends at St. Mary's Academy, which is located in Cherry Hills Village, Colorado. The picture was taken in 1970. When the family moved to Denver, Condi enrolled in the University of Denver's Lamont School of Music so that she could continue her piano studies. She also started taking ice skating lessons, which she loved. She says very clearly in her book she was never very good at it, but she absolutely loved it. Her parents put her in St. Mary's Academy because it was one of the oldest education institutions in Denver. It had an outstanding college preparatory curriculum, and that's what they were after for their daughter. The only drawback was that it was a Catholic school, but that was overcome because there was no religious education requirement in the curriculum. Soon Condi had the school uniform, and she was proudly wearing the navy and green plaid skirt, white blouse, blue, green, or white sweaters, a green blazer, green, blue, or white knee socks, and saddle shoes. She had arrived. She entered college at age 15. She is pictured here as when she's an undergraduate student at the University of Denver. Her 15th year was a major year of change for Condi. She graduated high school. She played as guest artist Mozart with the Denver Symphony, and her beloved mother, Angelina, was diagnosed with the breast cancer that would subsequently kill her. Condi had dreams, her family had planned and had dreams of her attending Juilliard or one of the other up east schools, but she would not leave her father and her mother under these circumstances. So instead she enrolled at Denver University, majoring in classical piano. While there, though, she took a class in political science taught by Joseph Corbel. He was former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's father. She hit her stride when she reached her university years. She continued the piano studies, but she fell in love with politics and with international affairs. She earned a bachelor's degree in political science in 1974. She earned a master's degree in economics from Notre Dame in 1975, and in 1981 she earned a doctorate in international studies from Denver University at the age of 27. Dr. Rice became Professor Rice when she joined the Department of Political Science, the faculty at Stanford University. There she taught classes that focused on Soviet policies and civil-military relations. Condi focused her research and her studies in graduate school on the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, Eastern European countries. And so she became rather early quite the expert on Soviet relations. This is a picture of Condi with President George H.W. Bush, President George Bush's father. This man was the first president to recognize her unique abilities in diplomacy based on her knowledge of Russian history. Condi has written in both of her memoirs how important mentors and role models have been in her life and her career. Perhaps they were never more so important than during those earliest days when she was transitioning from the academic world to the real world of international politics. When she was headhunted out of Stanford University to work as an advisor on Soviet relations and nuclear strategy to President George H.W. Bush, she quickly proved her depth of knowledge in international affairs, particularly those dealing with the Soviets and Eastern Europe. She said this once about role models, quote, "It's good to have female or minority role models, but the important thing is to have mentors who care about you, and they come in all colors." Her years in politics are pretty stunning. They span over a decade, but they span world events that none of us alive at the time will ever forget. In 1986, she was tapped to be an assistant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on nuclear strategy because nuclear arms, and that was part of her specialty as she was doing her graduate work. In 1989, under President George H.W. Bush, she served as Director for Soviet and Eastern European Affairs for the National Security Council and also was tagged as Special Assistant to the President. When his term was over, she returned happily to Stanford University, and 2 years after she got back there, she was named Provost. That was a job that she loved. Her academic life as provost was marked by two very important things that she accomplished. One, she balanced Stanford's budget. And two, she revamped the undergraduate curriculum. This is the official White House portrait of her when she is named to the National Security Council, and she still looks young. She's in her early 30s. She was introduced to George W. Bush by his father, George wanted, the father wanted his son to succeed in politics. And he felt like of all the areas where there might be weakness for his Texas governor's son, it might be international affairs. So he introduced the two of them. Rice said this about working in diplomacy, quote, "One of the hardest things about diplomacy is to put yourself into someone else's shoes without compromising your own principles." In 2001, she became the first woman head of the National Security Council. Remember, I told you at the very beginning, notice that she starts as head of national security for this country in 2001. After the terrorist attacks on 9/11, she defended Bush's decision to overthrow the terrorists, including Saddam Hussein, before Congress, and she earned her chops there. She was articulate, she was informed, and she was clear. She worked closely with others on Bush's team during the Iraq War in 2003. I don't think any of us who were alive on September the 11th, 2001 will ever forget the trauma of that day. Our entire country was traumatized. And more than I had really ever realized until I read No Higher Honor by Rice. The whole world was
Just
traumatized.
received word that a plane apparently has crashed into the
Clearly
tower.
something relatively devastating happening this morning there.
That there is more and more fire and smoke.
Another plane has hit Tower 2.
Horrific scene here. There's debris flying through
directly in the middle of one of the World Trade Center towers.
One of the first things that she does in her book is she explains where she was, what she was feeling, what it was like to be hauled down to the bunker, what it was like to try to keep up with the president who was being flown here, there, and everywhere because they didn't know quite what to do with him, to be under attack, but not knowing where the next attack might come. It was a difficult time, a very difficult time, and the Bush administration had only been in office 9 months. They met, as soon as the president got back with them, they met frequently, some in the bunker, some upstairs in the Situation Room. But their job was to figure out, what do we do now? It was a time when leadership has never been more important in our country. When you look at them, President Bush and the Bush team, what you see there is a team loaded with both strong personalities and lots of brains. Our country was lucky. Rice writes this, quote, "When I woke up the next morning, which was the morning of September 13th, I turned on the television. The scene was from London, and the Coldstream Guards were playing in the square outside Buckingham Palace. I realized that they were playing our national anthem. I broke down and cried." The Bush team had to process enormous amounts of information quickly. Each member contributed everything he or she had, but even more was needed. It was an exhausting time, and relief was no longer in sight. They developed 3 priorities quickly. Priority 1, keep America safe from additional attacks. Priority 2, identify and locate those responsible for the attacks. And priority 3, solidify relationships with America's allies and strengthen their resolve to combat terrorism. The book, No Higher Honor, does this whole period true justice because you get to see it from an insider's perspective. The team, President George W. Bush, newly elected president, brand new at this, Vice President Cheney, somewhat more seasoned in politics, but he's not been the vice president before, and neither one of them have faced this kind of thing. I have a couple of little things I'd like to read to you. It's what Condi wrote about these people on the team. About President Bush, she writes, "The president was finally back in the White House, and we were going over the speech that he would give to the nation. Included in the speech draft was the line, quote, 'We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed the acts and those who harbor them.' He thought over that line and said he wanted to keep it in. He asked what I thought. I told him that I thought he had to say it in the first message because later it would lose its impact. The Vice President, Secretary Powell, Secretary Rumsfeld all agreed that it remain." On Vice President Cheney at this period of time, she writes, "The National Security Advisor is basically left to sort out tensions between the State Department and the Vice President. In general, I got along well with my colleagues. The Vice President had direct access to the President and he used it. Often the Vice President and I also talked directly about what was on his mind. Later, when I became Secretary of State, he and I often disagreed and argued vociferously in front of the President, but it never became personal." Two others of the team, Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld, Senior Advisor and Deputy Chief of Staff Karl Rove. On Rumsfeld, Condi writes, "Secretary of State Colin Powell and Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld had known each other for years, and there was a good deal of personal respect. But there was an equal measure of distrust. The two did not confront each other face to face, let alone in front of the President. Rather, Don would send memos that implicitly and sometimes explicitly criticized what State or the Security Council was doing. After he left the Defense Department, interestingly enough, Rumsfeld wrote a memoir, and in it he says that Condi was from an academic world. She was always writing memos and always wanting to hold meetings and discuss whether they were needed or not. So there was a little friction there. On Deputy Chief of Staff Karl Rove, she wrote, "Karl struck just the right balance in discussing how speech would play politically, yet never trying to act as the foreign policy expert, even though he was extremely well read. I loved working with Karl, who is brilliant and funny and completely committed to the President's success. When I said that something wouldn't work in foreign policy terms, he took it on board. When he said that something wouldn't work politically, I accommodated him. Karl and I had an easy working relationship." Can you imagine being the chief officer in charge of national security advice to the President of the United States, and you have 9/11 happen 9 months into your tenure? She writes this about her particular experience with that horrible day. She says, "Not long after I got into the bunker, it occurred to me that we should contact the Russians." Remember, Russia, that's her bailiwick. "Russian military forces operate worldwide and sometimes in close proximity to our own. There was always a concern during the Cold War that raising the alert level of U.S. forces would spark the Soviets to do the same, causing a dangerous spiral upward of alerts. As it turned out, Putin had been trying to reach the President, who by now was somewhere between Florida and a secure location in Louisiana. I asked to speak to his number one aide, Sergei Ivanov, but Putin took the phone. 'Mr. President,' I said, 'the President is not able to take your call right now because he's being moved to another location. I wanted to let you know that American forces are going up on highest alert.' Putin replied, we already know, and we have canceled our exercises and brought our alert levels down. Is there anything else we can do? I thanked him, and for one brief moment, the thought flashed through my mind, the Cold War really is over. In 2005, when Bush begins his second term, he names Condi as his Secretary of State. She is to succeed General Colin Powell. She becomes the first African-American woman to hold that post. Because she had worked for a while very well with Colin Powell, and because he had been a mentor for her for years, she often sought him out for guidance, and the transfer from one secretary to the other was pretty seamless. It's interesting looking back, we realize now that the decisions that Powell made and that Condi made would help shape history for decades to come. The Bush administration had been in place less than 9 months when America came under attack from terrorists. Suddenly, the Bush team was challenged as few administrations had ever been. All were capable, but all were stretched to their limits during the immediate crisis and for the remainder of their term. Condi wrote, "I think September 11th was one of those great earthquakes that clarify and sharpen. Events are in much sharper relief. We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud." When the second term of President George W. Bush ended, Condoleezza Rice could finally go home. America's top diplomat planned to exit the world stage and just go home to her beloved California. During her tenure as secretary, she had visited more than 75 countries and had traveled about 500,000 miles by air. One of the things that helped her so much, remember, those parents made sure that she had advantages, that she learned things. One of the things that helped her most as Secretary of State was that she had a working knowledge of several foreign languages. She had French, she had German and Spanish, but her strongest language was Russian. And because she was fluent in Russian and very knowledgeable in Russian history, she was especially useful to America with Soviet relations. In August of 2012, Rice was invited to do a keynote at the Republican National Convention. Second night, and in her speech, she answered the question on so many minds, would she return to public service? This was her answer. "I'll go back after this gathering and be a happy Stanford University faculty member. And obviously, I'll do what I can to help this ticket. But my life is in Palo Alto. My future is with my students at Stanford and in public service on issues that I care about, like education reform." One thing that never left her was that love for music and an almost need for playing the piano, even though for about 20 years in there she never had real time to play it the way she wanted to. But she always saw music as a collaboration, particularly if she were playing with another person on the world stage. She saw it as a very bonding kind of experience. May 6th of 2017, she played accompaniment to Yo-Yo Ma. He's a cellist. She had met him first at Stanford University. He was considered to be the greatest living cellist of all time. Ma was set to receive the National Medal of Arts and reached out to Condi to see if they might play something together at the ceremony. They decided to play Brahms' D minor violin sonata, a piece popular with classical cellists like Ma. That evening, the two played before the president and 2,000 guests, and they played beautifully. Condi writes, "It was one of the most memorable days of my life. I'd come full circle and back to music. But I wasn't confused about what my real destiny was. I would never have played with Mao had I stayed in music. He played with me because I was the national security advisor who could also play the piano. I had made a good decision when I changed my college major." Her life after public service has been very interesting. Her mother did eventually die of breast cancer, and so to honor her mother, she regularly supports the Race for the Cure and other similar charitable organizations. She doesn't skate anymore, ice skating, but she does love her golf game. She made this comment, "I wish someone had put a golf club in my hands, not skates on my feet. It is a really great game for business. It's a great game for making connections." So whenever she can, she hits the links and plays some golf. She's played in several Pro-Am tournaments through the years, and she's done pretty well. She once was described as a true patriot, and her love of country was said to have been just slightly above her love for football. She was tapped to serve on the college football playoff committee, a major appointment. She said this about her attraction to football, quote, "I find football so interesting strategically. It's the closest thing to war. What you are doing is taking and yielding territory and have certain strategies and tactics." Not surprisingly, the woman who had begun studying to be a classical concert pianist when she was 3 has never forgotten her first love. Even as that proposed career got sidetracked with international studies and international politics, she still managed to find some time to play, often while she was in public service and often overseas. This is her playing a concert in Kuala Lumpur in 2006. She's Secretary of State at the time. Whether she was playing on a small electric organ in her parents' home, or sitting on a piano bench next to her grandmother learning to read music, or later taking advanced music classes as she honed her craft to become a classic concert pianist, Condoleezza Rice loved music. Even a detour into international policy that took her from the concert stage to the world stage for a time, she still loved music. While on the world stage and after, she sought ways to use her talent to make a difference wherever she could. Music has been the one constant in her life.